Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to this afternoon session. I decided to dynamize the course of this meeting, and albeit we have four distinguished panel speakers, I managed to convince them that we shall be speaking in 3 panel rounds instead of 4 separate speeches. To conform to our organizers' wishes, we shall be focusing on the topic of Christians and their attitude to the Holocaust. This is hugely important since we have met here at this conference Jan Karski, Memory and Responsibility. As has been emphasized by organizers in this very interesting written introduction to this conference, Jan Karski, as a deeply believing Christian, a human being and a Pole, felt co-responsible for the fact that no assistance was provided. He actually was struggling all his life with this question concerning responsibility. This particular panel is to serve the purpose of responding to the question to what extent Christianity and the Church actually managed the question concerning Christian co-responsibility for the Holocaust. This is something we had been talking about during the previous panel, and we might refer to it. So our question is, how do Christians manage their memory? We have been asked to discuss changes which have occurred as a consequence of the Holocaust. Without further ado, and without wasting time to introduce our panel speakers, you will find their biograms in your conference kits. Let me therefore start with a question addressing all of you gentlemen, but I will start with Father Professor John Pawlikowski. The question is, why and how did it happen that Christianity decided to treat the Holocaust as an occurrence which will need to be rethought in Christian categories? How did it come to pass that the Holocaust actually became a premise for the rethinking of the topic?
Just a little bit of background. I came to know Jan Karski in the latter days of his life, mostly through 2 organizations or institutions. One was the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I was very centrally involved in the development of that, and Karski was a resource. But even more importantly, through the National Polish-American Jewish-American Council, of which Karski was a very important member and advisor, and I served as co-chair of that organization. In that context, we had a number of conversations. Obviously, I being in Chicago, he being in Washington, we didn't have the kind of frequent discussions that Rabbi White had with him being on the same campus. But the one issue that I was particularly interested in speaking with Karski had to do with his tremendous interest in what I would call international moral responsibility. What does the Holocaust tell us, teach us about the importance of international responsibility in this age? I come to the issue as a professional social ethicist. That has been my area of teaching. And I'm very interested in this question of global responsibility and what the Holocaust can teach us. Very quickly, because we agreed we would all take only a few minutes, let me just put out on the table a number of ways in which I think the Holocaust has changed the nature of moral responsibility in our age. Number one, I think that there must be now a fundamental respect for human dignity, and that must supplant any notion that only correct belief entitles one to fundamental rights. Those of you who know something about the history of the Second Vatican Council, you know that there was a very, very deep-seated and often contentious discussion about this issue between, say, Cardinal Taviani and the American Jesuit Father John Courtney Murray. And in the end, the document on religious liberty affirmed more or less Murray's position that the basis of human dignity has to be understood as being part of our birthright. Secondly, people like Holocaust scholar Helen Fine have spoken of the need to expand our universe of moral concern as a result of the Holocaust. We must broaden our sense of moral concern beyond the parameters of our own faith and national communities. Thirdly, I think there must be an acknowledgement by religious traditions that at times they have contributed to hatred, to even genocide, and so on. And that sort of cleansing is a precondition, I think, for the important role that religion ought to play in global responsibility in our time. Fourthly, I think from a strictly Christian point of view, we need to ask the question, what does the Holocaust teach us about the nature of religious leadership in times of social crisis? For me, for example, that's a far more important question in a way than even regarding the papacy of Pius XII, than what is this actual record. What kind of vision of religious leadership do we need in light of the Holocaust experience? Also, how do we understand the church as an institution in the midst of international social crises? These, I think, are fundamental questions that require some further discussion, some further response. We've seen some changes, I think. I often speak, for example, of what happened in Malawi some years after the Holocaust, where the bishops of the country stood up against Dr. Hastings Banda, the president, when he began to put to death people who practiced indigenous religion. They risked the institutional survival, even their own personal survival, because he threatened to kill all of them if they continued in their protest. And yet they did, and they did so on behalf of people who weren't even part of the Christian community. And I think that, again, is that emphasis on recognition of the fundamental dignity of each person. So those are just, in very, very brief form, some of the lessons I have taken from the Holocaust. I think they're ones that Karski would embrace. Let me just end by saying, I think one of the more important developments that we have right now is this responsibility to protect legislation, which was passed by the United Nations in 2005. I don't know what the Polish government and whether they signed this document. They have. The United States government has not. The Secretary of State at the time did sign it, but it's never been presented to Congress for approval, for fear, I'm afraid, that it will not pass.
Dr. Krzysztof
Dorosz, how do you see these questions and dilemmas faced by Catholic and Christian thinkers in the wake of the Holocaust? Well, those questions remain unsolved. They are now being resolved as we speak. Let me recall a certain story told by Gross in his book Fear. During Nazi occupation in Warsaw, a boy asked his mother, "Mummy, did they kill a Jew or a human being?" Similar stories proving the dehumanizing of Jews by Christians have been quoted in Jan Tomasz Gross's book. But not only, similar stories can be found in literature, in abundant literature, speaking of different countries and different circumstances. Therefore, what we are facing is a dehumanizing of the Jews. The dehumanizing of the Jew. What we are facing here is a phenomenon that I would refer to as the Jew delusion, in an analogy to Richard Dawkins' God delusion. Throughout our history, we have been facing Jew delusions or Jews' delusion. not Jews of flesh and blood. Which is why, Janek, forgive me, but I will refer to your book yet again, or rather to an interview which you gave to Tygodnik Powszechny, the weekly. You said that you are surprised with the phenomenon of anti-Semitism in a country free of Jews. From the viewpoint of sociology, it may seem weird. From the viewpoint of conflicts between minority and majority, yes, indeed. But what we had here was the myth of a Jew the Deicide, from the roots, from the very origins of Christianity until today. And today, possibly, we will never ever hear the question of whether it was a Jew or a human being. But I do have a distant friend who said that, well, we don't like Jews. You do not have to love or like the French or the American. But the truth is, she had never ever in her life seen a Jew. It is still the same Jew delusion fixed in our heads. Only in the wake of the Holocaust, Christian thinkers or theologists, not all of them, during Eichmann's trial, a Catholic priest resident in Tel Aviv said, what a pity that they were not all murdered. A Catholic priest. Thus, possibly no one dare, even if they think that way, say whether it was a Jew or a human being, but the sediment is there, and that is a thing for the future we shall be speaking of during the third round. I do believe that the Holocaust had triggered a shock in the conscience and way of thinking of Christians, albeit not all of them. I believe that shock triggered a process, an unfinished process, to see the Jew as a person of flesh and blood. Obviously, when you try to respond to the question, what kind of impact did Holocaust have on Christianity, but what you obviously quote is the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate, but that is just one of the milestones. I remember that I went to London to listen to Cardinal Stefan who did refer to Nostra Aetate, but he appealed to his audience to graft Nostra Aetate to grassroots. And it is very important to understand how important it was to establish daily rituals between us and the Jews, to drink tea, coffee and wine together to be friends. Well, thank you for that. How did the process look like in the Catholic Church? Bishop Grzegorz Ryś. Let me refer to a number of statements made already. When it comes to the rule of the Church, the magisterium, yes, indeed, Nostra Aetate is the fundamental document, that document of 1965. Authors of the document, and those who decided to add further texts to it, certain regulations which were meant to make the document concrete, say with absolute conviction that this change to the Church's mentality would not have happened were it not for the Holocaust. The Holocaust forced the Church to change their way of thinking with regard to Jews and Israel. There are three fundamental matters with regard to Nostra Aetate, and they are definitely of breakthrough importance. Firstly, the statement that the chosen people are the chosen people, as further divine appeals are irrevocable. This is something that has been quoted from the 11th chapter of the Epistle to the Romans directly. So it is definitely a people of the covenant, and we are interested in their religious history in the wake of 1970. And that is a huge breakthrough in the way of thinking. Suffice to study the relation of the Church to the Jews to find out what a breakthrough it was. In the first epistle of Pseudo Barnabas, it is said that God broke the covenant, not only in Jesus Christ and his Golgotha, but also on the Sinai. Pseudo Barnabas and Tertullian and further theological deliberations prove that the covenant is no longer there. It has been broken. When you read the Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, by Pope Francis, it has been declared that the chosen people are the chosen people. He declares it as something obvious. I do believe that this is very important. Nevertheless, it is the another question is how common that belief is. And also we have to talk about the relation of the Church to the chosen people of Israel. We ought to ask the question, what is it that binds us, and how it is that we should describe our mutual relations. In the wake of Nostra Aetate, Pope VI established the Commission for Religious Relations with Israel in the year 1974. And hugely importantly, that commission was placed as part of the Papal Commission for Christian Unity, not as part of the Commission for Interreligion Dialogue, something that was our own idea, and indeed some Jews were indignated because they're not Christian. Nevertheless, there were a couple of reasons for which that commission had been placed as it had been. Firstly, that the dialogue of different churches with Judaism does also carry an ecumenical dimension. As Christian churches, we can come close to one another. Also, because as part of our dialogue with Judaism, our identity becomes more and more pronounced. The other reason is that we should not approach Judaism as a religion alien to Christianity, or alien to the extent that all other religions are. A very important and interesting analysis by Cardinal Kasper had been formulated, who decided to describe Christian Jewish religion that had been mentioned in the Council of Chalcedon in the debate concerning the united yet double nature of the divine. And also, with regard to what Professor Dorosz said, indeed in Nostra Aetate it has been said that Jews are not to be blamed for the death of Christ, and also under the Catholic Catechism, supported by John Paul II, it has been said that it was the Christians who were most to blame for the death of Christ. That responsibility has for too long a time been shifted on to the Jews. It is beyond saying, it goes without saying, that it is the Christians who are to blame for the death of Christ. And obviously that goes beyond deicide and is passed on to fratricide. Fratricide was a much better cliché, because then we come to the crime of Cain and we can introduce further motives. Cain was banished, hence the diaspora, which is exactly why you can indulge in meta-historical and other ideas. Professor Grosfeld, was the breakthrough indeed that huge? I really liked what the bishop said, that the church was actually forced by history, indeed, to become revived. They were forced to a revival. Yes, the church's revival came through Jews, which is hugely moving, because since the church, the New Testament, the Second Testament, declares that salvage is a thing of the Jews, the thing becomes hugely interesting. Probably many of us do not know, how did the Catholic Church decide in the wake of World War II to establish relations with the Jews? Jules Isaac, a French rabbi, came to see the Pope and said, "This cannot be so. We have to do something." So the idea came from a Jew. It did not come in itself and was not born of a trauma. It turned out that in Christian culture something terrible happened. But what we needed was a Jew, and that is truly beautiful because it impacts everything that came later on and our contemporariness. Saint Paul said that it is the root that supports you. In other words, it is not Christians, us Christians who should support the Jews. No, the root supports us, which ultimately means that the root is alive. This ultimately means, this is something we shall be speaking about in the third round, hence a question was born. Is it important to us that Judaism is present and that Jews are alive? It turns out that it is absolutely important. Judaism is not coming to an end. It has been declared that it shall continue existing until the end of the world, and only at the end of the world we shall find how it is truly. But we need Jews and Judaism for the Church and Christianity to remain alive. This is something deeply moving and something that we never mentioned, that at the end of the day, the point is not to establish good relations with the Jews. We should have good relations with everybody. Those relations are usually mediocre at the best, but it is of fundamental importance to Christians not only to establish such relations, but also to change one's mentality and to understand through the Shoah, not the Holocaust. I believe that the Holocaust is a horrific term. So what we need is to alter our mentality as to the essence. In brief, we ought to free ourselves from a certain amalgamate, which was created in Europe when Christianity came to us from Israel, from the Middle East, and blended in with pagan beliefs. It turns out that the Shoah became the most powerful phenomenon in history, allowing us to free ourselves not of the remnants, but of pagan beliefs and pagan beliefs concerning religions in Europe in general. Hence the question arises, Benedict said about Jews that they are fathers, not brothers. Brothers came before, but they are fathers. The question arises, what is it? How is it? It turns out that they are our fathers in faith. It turns out that there are hugely important components or elements which ultimately mean that Christianity was born of bonds of blood. It turns out that what we have is a family where we coexist, and obviously in every family it is very difficult to coexist because it is much easier to love the black people of Congo than someone who is of your own family. Polemics, briefly. Krzysztof Dorosz. Janek, I have known you for many years. I know what you think. I cannot accuse you of bad intentions. You might declare that I am picking on you, but I found two elements in your speech which I found deeply disturbing. You said that Jews brought about the revival of the church. Hence my dramatic question, did we need 6 million victims in order to revive the church? Well, probabilities are not my forte, the ifs and wherefores, but the historical chronology gives us the answer. I do not know what would have happened, but the Holocaust did happen, and the church was revived, although it is no mean feat. These changes happened at a very high level, at the level of an idea, and these ideas will have to be implemented because, as Bishop Ryś told us, those changes were of a breakthrough nature. Experts have told us again and again that the Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council carries no footnotes to previous church documents. It does have footnotes to the Bible, yes indeed, which is why things have to be made precise. Hence the changes at the level of ideas have to be grafted down to practice. A question to Father Professor Pawlikowski, how was it in different countries? And then we shall focus on Poland.
Well, internationally, from my experience of working within the International Council of Christians and Jews, based at Martin Buber House in Heppenheim, Germany, I see some of the major issues as these. There is great concern in the Jewish community about the rise of anti-Semitism in parts of Europe. There's no question about that. I think probably France is the premier case in that regard, but nonetheless, there's a fear that it's rising in a number of places and that some of the old cliches and stereotypes are beginning to reemerge. I think one of the most serious questions and difficult questions is, in fact, the question of Israel. The Christian community, I think, is in some transition on that issue, but it's creating a situation where it's becoming increasingly difficult, in my experience, to be able to have a serious, in-depth discussion of the current situation in the Middle East. As you may know, there is a sort of a group of bishops, Catholic bishops, who have been, I guess, appointed actually to take a special interest in the situation in Israel-Palestine. The head of that group is Cardinal Nichols of Westminster, and they have come out with some significantly critical assessment of Israeli policy in the current situation. So how we can get through a real discussion of that, I think, is a real challenge, because for many in the Jewish community, the issue of Israel is of primary concern. I do think that the unfortunate emergence of the threats against Christians in the Middle East has had some new impact on that discussion, because I think many Christians now recognize some of the threats to their own existence that I think Jews have also been, and Israelis have been recognizing. But that I think remains a real challenge, and we'll have to see where it takes us.
Thank you. Może zacznijmy teraz od profesora Grosfelda.
Let me now start with Professor Grosfeld. He has been a member of the Episcopal Council for Dialogue with Judaism and the Polish Council of Christians and Jews. Janek, what do you believe are Polish achievements in terms of adapting the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and what not? Let me add 2 sentences to bridge the gap between the 2 rounds. I have not said something which I believe to be hugely important to the question of what the Holocaust and the Shoah were. I believe that we should focus on anthropology. We should focus on the concept of man, because we did experience a certain apogee in terms of the Holocaust and Hitler's ideology. We had a certain apogee in thinking about man, which is a negation of the Christian and Judeo-Christian way of thinking. Man as a weak entity. That's Christianity and that's the Jews. To what extent Christianity followed that is a totally different question altogether. I believe that the rejection of Jews focused on Jews and their capacity. Nietzsche was hugely important to Hitler, and that was for a reason, although probably if Nietzsche found what Hitler used his belief to, he would be terrified. Nietzsche said that we should destroy the catechism, we should destroy the commandments. It turns out that Nietzsche believed that human beings are weak. And I must say that this thesis was very strongly present in European identity mixed in with certain natural pagan beliefs of man. Walking away from that amalgamate through the war and the Holocaust or Shoah was very, very difficult. Interestingly enough, it was much easier at the central level of the Church, at the level of the Vatican, as it happened in ancient time when papal bulls said that you cannot oppress or kill Jews. No one should do anything extreme. Nevertheless, that did not translate onto other dimensions of human life. The Christian-Jewish dialogue is important. The question is to whom? Is it important to the Christians or to Jews? It is necessary for Christians because we need to get to know one another. What Krzysztof Dorosz said about the Jewish myth, once it turns out that we touch the Jew, I apologize for touching you, Krzysztof, once you encounter the Jew, the myth disappears, which is exactly why every anti-Semite needs his or her Jew on duty. And that was very easy, because that specific Jew did not evolve from a myth, but from that specific evolvement. It is hugely important to notice the mass impact of Christian teachings or church teachings on what evolved and what developed in Poland. Selected sociological studies prove that, unfortunately, stereotypes tend to fester in their unchanged form. Why? Because mentality is the most difficult thing of all to change. I believe that it is also much easier for bishops to understand Christianity than it is to an average human being who got used to a certain way of thinking, even if basing on school teachings. When I talk to people, they tell me, well, I was told in religion classes at school that things are totally different. I probably should expect them to tell their local bishop that I am into heresy. Nevertheless, the thing is very poorly known. There are both church and secular teachers dwelling on the matter, but I do believe that what we need are awards. The Polish Christian-Jewish Council presents awards to priests. We are clerical. Why to priest? Because it is the parish priest who carries the key to his congregation's souls. His parishioners will take it easier from a parish priest than from a TV journalist. I don't think that we should be hugely optimistic, since we have hundreds of years of contempt being taught and of belief that one chosen people was replaced by another. It will not take a long time to reverse the trend, but it will not be speedy. Let me mention a very utilitarian thing. Why did Christians decide that we cannot reject Jews? Well, because God rejected some people, He's going to reject others very shortly. Father, do you agree with such thesis? At least long term? Well, with regard to the previous discussion concerning the revival of the Church, I don't think that we should bring everything down to a single thesis. The Council, the Second Vatican Council, was necessary because the 19th century was about the Church walking away from the world. The gap, the dramatic gap, grew, and the reason for that had been the concept of freedom. Throughout the 19th century, the Church attempted to influence the world with the aid of methods which are not its own, for example, the church state, and so on and so forth. We may indeed find that the Holocaust showed the extent of the gap. What we see as church teachings proved absolutely empty in many dimensions, and the fruit of the process was hugely dramatic. Nevertheless, I do believe, because it is not true that the Council only focused on the Christian-Jewish relations, the Council focused on a great number of topics. Obviously, the Holocaust was an issue. It was a very important one. What Father Jan said, well, it is very easy to write at the level of Nostra Aetate and Evangelii Gaudium. It is very easy to declare that the chosen people are the chosen people. Nevertheless, as long as we pray on Good Friday for Jews who used to be a chosen people, as long as that prayer remains unchanged, we cannot change overall mentality. That is true for Poland. This is why I speak of my own sensitivity. I have been changing that prayer for many years. It is actually a problem for me. I still remember what Cardinal Wojtyła and then the Pope said, that if you change the liturgy, then it means that you have lack of faith. It is not easy for a bishop to change the words of the Mass. But what to do? I think of all these who listen to the prayer year after year. Good Friday is the most popular day among Poles, not Easter Sunday. It is Good Friday. The most important common prayer of the year comes on Good Friday. Before we change that, let us not speak of chosen people, because everybody remembers that the Jews used to be chosen people. Well, I know that the Polish episcopate had actually confirmed the new translation, but it had not permeated. Well, for the past 3 years, I have become used to the fact that bishops are to blame for everything, but it is not entirely true. When it comes to liturgy, actually, we have been changing that text in cooperation with the Commission for the Congregation and Liturgy, but indeed, we do need to work on it. I will never withdraw from that example, because it shows us wherein the problem lies. It would be quite easy to change mentality at the level of the elites or very active Christian groups. Nevertheless, when it comes to the common or to the general society, we cannot stop at that. What we need is common acceptance. One other thing that I would like to add, something that we should absolutely reverse, and that is what the Papal Commission for Religious Relations with Judaism said, is that we should reverse the negative balance of those relationships for the past 2,000 years. And that is a document that was published in 1974, 1 month after the commission was formed. It was then declared that we have had 2,000 years of negative relations, and that is no easy thing to change. Well, from the historical perspective, half a century is nothing. One other thing that we ought to add, in order to walk away from that very dark picture, a lot of good things have been happening, but as it usually happens, in small doses. And once something happens that can impact Poland, all of Poland, it is then broadcast by the Trwam television broadcasting center. What I would like to mention is the concert that was organized in front of the Auschwitz-Birkenau gate, when 30 rabbis arrived from Israel. Cardinal Dziwisz was the head of that meeting, and the concert was not only about beautiful music. You should have heard words said by the rabbis. For example, our beloved Rabbi Greenberg, and you should have heard what Cardinal Dziwisz said. And I must say that those words were surprising, not only for a cardinal. Well, obviously, it was not really important what was said, but it was great that the Shema was sung. Hark Thee, O Israel was sung by 30 bishops and 30 rabbis. Well, what is the Polish practice in the eyes of a non-Catholic? Well, I do not dare speak of Christian practice, also because for the past 30 years I was actually absent from Poland. Nevertheless, let me mention a few minorities or a few minor things, but possibly they are representative. Mr. Grosfeld is correct in saying that we have the minority of beautiful things, but Jan Karski was an individual. All those who believe, Christians and Jews, for reasons of their faith, attach great importance to what a single human being does, because that can actually reverberate throughout the universe. Just a couple of those minorities, if I may. Several years ago, Professor Bartoszewski, who was then the president of the Pen Club, and I have the honor and pleasure of being part of the board, well, he said that never had Poland had such a beautiful attitude towards Jews. And he was speaking of the younger generation, actually. And that is a small snapshot. And another, if I may, in my own church, in the Reformed Church, a very small church, and which, historically speaking, was recognized as a very specific one, despite all the anti-Semitic developments. Well, actually, it was considered to be as not very friendly towards Jews. And when talking to a parish priest, we found, and I must say that our church is quite liberal, and he began wondering, whom would I reject from my church? He said, someone who does not accept the Holy Trinity and someone who is an anti-Semite. And another matter which concerns people other than Christians as well. I would like to speak of the conscience shock caused by the Holocaust. Shock to the conscience of the believers and the non-believers. And I must say that Poland bred a small group, a minority of people who really went through it with great trauma. I met a young person deeply into philosophy who had never encountered any Jews and who had in secondary school was truly shocked by the Holocaust. I do not know what that person is doing now. I believe that she is now in the States. She decided to convert to Orthodox Judaism for a very pure reason, pang of conscience. That is not frequent, obviously, but this is what tends to happen. We do have some Polish writers, they're also a minority, who decide to speak of and describe Judaism. And now let us proceed with the final round of the panel. Then we will invite you all for a Q&A session. What are the key problems for today and tomorrow? What key problems have to be resolved in order for the Jewish-Christian relations to actually be resolved and for them to become better 2 or more decades after the Holocaust?
Well, let me name a number of the, I think, challenging issues before us. My increasing experience is that there's a movement towards a much wider interreligious dialogue. In many of those interreligious dialogues, the Christian-Jewish dialogue is not present. Now, some people bemoan that, and some people criticize that. I think it's inevitable that we are moving even beyond the Abrahamic family to a wider dialogue. And I think our challenge for those of us who have been involved in Christian-Jewish dialogue is how we can constructively integrate the Christian-Jewish dialogue into that wider interreligious dialogue. Because
not losing its specific character, yeah?
Yes.
Its unique character.
Yes, that's right. And I think it has something to offer, a special gift to the interreligious dialogue. I'm not going to go into that. I think that another challenge still facing us, we've had tremendous progress in the field of biblical studies and in the history of the first several centuries of the Christian-Jewish relationship. But very little of that has moved over into systematic theology. You pick up even a very contemporary book on systematic theology today, you'll hardly see in most of them any reference to this vast body of new biblical literature, which is changing the whole understanding of how the Christian and Jewish communities, or whether we can even speak of distinctively Christian and Jewish communities in the first couple of centuries. So I think that's another challenge. I think a third challenge that I would say is the increasing affirmation on the part of the Israeli political leadership of certain groups of Christian evangelicals. I would also include the so-called Christian caucus in the Israeli Knesset. I find that somewhat insulting to the rest of the Christian community because some of these people, in my judgment, are verge on the crazy. And I speak especially of someone like John Hagee. John Hagee just about 10 days ago gave a major speech in which he blamed President Obama for the Ebola outbreak because President Obama has not supported Israel enough. Well, that's stupid. And for the Israeli Prime Minister to embrace that kind of stupidity, in my judgment, is a kind of insult to the rest of the Christian community, and especially those of us in the mainline Protestant and Catholic communities who have worked very constructively on Christian-Jewish relations and also on trying to help people in the Christian community understand the Jewish attachment to the land that's authentic. But to embrace this, I find this very, very problematical. Anyway, those are some of the challenges I would put forth.
Biskup Grzegorz Ryś, najważniejsze
Bishop Grzegorz Ryś, the fundamental challenges for today and tomorrow? I do believe that memory is such challenge. I also came back to the very well-known text, We Remember. Yes, it is a document from the Vatican. Yes, by the same commission, actually. A very important document. It was written over a span of 10 years and actually deeply inspired by Pope John Paul II, and I checked. Actually, the word memory is mentioned twice in that text. We remember, or remembrance, is also mentioned only twice throughout the text. To forget, also twice, that we cannot forget. We cannot forget that the Holocaust did happen, and we should not forget those who saved Jews. The text was written over a span of more than 10 years, and it does not dwell on memory. That text is quite a weak text about the mutual Christian-Jewish relations. It is imbalanced. It is a poor or weak historical text. Nevertheless, it does dwell on history rather than on memory. We have never faced the music of our own memory of the Holocaust. No such text has been written so far. The result, and actually, I have many such conversations. My colleagues know that I am part of the International Auschwitz Council, and my colleagues ask me, why should Christians care about Auschwitz? Well, I say because it was we who have killed. It was not us who were killed. It turns out that they find it offensive. They believe that the Nazis were something that dropped out of the clear blue sky. It is not us. They are not us. This text, We Remember, contains a postulate that we need to preserve our memory. We need to preserve our moral and religious memory. But there is no such thing as a pure memory. We set the memory of the Holocaust aside. We leave it to the Jews. And that is the other face of the problem. So we are asked, why do you only remember Auschwitz? Why cannot you remember that you have been living in Poland for 1,000 years and you had a beautiful life here? Why do you only want Auschwitz? Those questions, while legitimate, lead nowhere. That document was a declaration that we want to remember and that it is important to our ethics and for our faith. For the time being, I believe that this is the fundamental question, how that memory ought to be shaped how it ought to be preserved. We should also ask whether memory should resemble the marches of remembrance, where we have a single class in Cracow arriving at our place, one classroom, one class of people of all the secondary schools in Cracow with a single teacher, and that teacher takes her class of students to the March of Remembrance, which is quite terrifying. Who else will remember? I believe that memory is the most important thing of all. If we fail to remember, then why do we need all these declarations of memory, especially in Poland? Krzysztof Dorosz. I fully agree with the bishop that memory is important, but I would tend to expand it. The question is, the memory of what? Memory of the Holocaust? Yes, indeed, but that should definitely go further. What we need is a memory of the Jew delusion created by Christianity. The origins of the Jew delusion have become obscure in history. We do not have any clear explanation for that. We do need the explanation, and we do need that memory. It will take on the form of very specific remembrance. Without that, we will get nowhere. Without that, we cannot move. What we also need is a memory, or possibly a historical analysis of phenomena which impacted anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, something that Paweł Śpiewak mentioned during one of the previous sessions. Hitler did not drop out of the clear blue sky, and regrettably Hitler based his beliefs on Christianity. Let us not be misled. I'm speaking of Christian models and of Christian beliefs. The Jew delusion indeed stems from Christianity, from the Christian poison. A Spanish proverb says that the devil hides behind the altar. And indeed, that Jew delusion is that devil hiding behind the altar. This is something that we ought to permeate. This is something we ought to study. With regard to the future, let me go back to what I said before. Jan Grosfeld mentioned that it is hugely important to establish relations, and what Bogdan Białek does, organizing the close encounters, is very, very important, and it is also beautiful. It is a first in Polish post-war history. Jews and Christians meet to have coffee, to discuss things, to discuss their memory, and I do believe that this ought to be continued. But obviously it is more than just meetings. What we need is a backdrop of religious conscience, or indeed a theological conscience, thanks to which we will enter the fundamental question, why was the Jew delusion born? And then we can actually reach something very difficult for us. Last but not least, in 1964, an American Catholic priest, Edward Flannery, wrote his Anguish of the Jews. And he offers a thesis that the fundamental root of anti-Semitism is that of the accusation of deicide. Obviously, that goes beyond Father Flannery. The thesis was quite common. We have to ask the question, whence the accusation? We also have to ask, why did it become so popular? Because I do believe that it comes very, very close to paying homage to icons. Can we kill God, is the question. Well, Krzysztof, another question. The example of Bogdan Białek's initiatives is excellent, and I love his initiatives. Nevertheless, he goes beyond the dialogue of remembrance. He engages into the dialogue, or engages in the dialogue of life. We do need memory. Don't we need memory? Yes, indeed, we do need memory, we do need remembrance. Nevertheless, that question provokes the response that memory is not sufficient. Bogdan Białek, with his close encounters, takes the matter a step further. Thanks to what he is doing, we do understand that the memory of life is what is the most important thing of all. Jan Grosfeld. I jotted it down in pencil that I believe that the most important search is the search for myself. I need to understand who I am. Without that, we are going to focus on a tedious moralism, that we need to be good, that we need to remember, that we need to establish relations. Well, I understand that we are trying to respond to the question, what should Christians do, not what should Jews do. In other words, Christian, know thyself. Christian, understand what is your Jewish dimension. Where do you come from? Since the Jews say we are witnesses, witnesses to what is the question? I do believe that the process itself is very slow. It is a process of conversion. And I do believe that also this is how Christians will cease being a shame to the world because of their divisions. Well, what we need is unity. This is how we are known. Okay, a Jew, a Catholic, a Christian. So, what makes you one? What is your unity with every suffering person all about? How can that be shown? How can it be displayed? Let me also tell you something that I heard from Rabbi Rosen in Birkenau during the concert. He was telling me a very well-known Jewish story. A Hasid rabbi declares how much he learned about compassion and the depth of the words from the book of Deuteronomy. And it is said that two drunks speak, and Ivan said, and one of the drunks says to the other, Ivan, do you love me? Of course I love you. Ivan, do you know what hurts me? How can I know, Boris, what hurts you? Well, Ivan, if you do not know what is painful to me, then how can you tell me that you love me? Thank you very much. Bishop Ryś wanted to add something. It is hugely important to me to distinguish between the two, memory and history. We do not focus on history. Well, as Father Jan said, there are many historical works. You can write volume after volume about what truly happened between Christians and Jews. We can indeed try to resolve the historical riddle, the question that Professor Dorosz asked us, but that does not necessarily translate into remembrance. Well, this is what the Pope said about the positive. Europe has a fantastic history and no memory thereof. And this is also the history we have, and this is an area that we have no memory of either. Indeed, what Professor Grosfeld said is true. We need to understand who we are. Memoria futuri is a term used. I remember for the future, not for the past. You have to make specific choices on the basis of your past. You have to choose what you continue, and that is hugely important. It has so come to pass, well, that what we have now is the what Pope Francis referred to as the culture of the temporary. Nothing is fixed, nothing is permanent, which is also why memory is important. So this is something that we ought to recognize as the most important. Yes, memory does not only reside in the head. Ladies and gentlemen, we have another 30 minutes for a Q&A session and questions from the floor. I see 2 or 3 people willing to speak. Let me start with Bogdan Białek, the co-chairman of the Polish Jewish Council and the Jan Karski Association chapter in Kielce. Thank you very much for this conversation. Yet again, it has become obvious to me that the Jewish-Christian dialogue is actually a Christian-Christian dialogue. To tell you the truth, before the debate I spoke to the bishop briefly, and I believe I will commit no indiscretion if I quote the bishop, who said that the Christian-Jewish dialogue is not really an inter-religious dialogue. So what I hear is that what we have is religious dialogue in the midst of Christianity, and this is something I have heard from all you gentlemen. I have a question to all the four gentlemen present here, and obviously, whoever of you wants to respond shall. Marek Edelman, a person very close to my heart, said that the Holocaust cast a shade over all mankind. It affected each and every human being, regardless of whether they know anything about the Holocaust or not. I understand that Marek Edelman wanted to say that the Holocaust happened regardless, or all other things notwithstanding. And that also means that everything before and after the Holocaust have to be reread and reinterpreted. Some things have become unimportant, whereas others have taken on a new meaning. Now, us Christians, have we actually understood what is the Christian response to the experience of the Holocaust, and how deeply did the Holocaust experience reach into the Christian experience and Jewish experience? What I would expect is a theological and practice response. You gentlemen have already responded to a certain extent, and probably all of us present here could quote hundreds of examples of how Christians did not absorb the Holocaust or the Shoah. All of a sudden, we are facing stereotypes and prejudice, and we are also facing anti-Semitic reactions in the church and the secular world alike. All that continues to be present. I understand, and I must say that the bishop responded to that very, very deeply, I believe, also recalling the prayer on Good Friday. Nevertheless, that is not all. We also have to understand how we Christians respond to the evil of the world, omnipresent evil of the world, from the very small occurrences when a dark-skinned person was beaten up on one of the Warsaw streets, Białostocka Street. I have not heard any Catholic priest respond to it or react to the fact that someone was beaten up just because of the color of the skin. And I must say that the response to Rwanda was also very weak. Father Pawlikowski mentioned Mali, but Rwanda happened as well. Yes, John Paul II did say that huge misery is going on in Rwanda. Nevertheless, how do we, all Christians of the world, respond? Our response is very poor, very weak. We cannot even respond to evil targeting our Christian brothers murdered throughout the world, although that obviously is not a very good comparison. I do believe, obviously it is so, that the Second Vatican Council did take a huge step forward when it comes to church teachings in comparisons to the previous position. I do not wish to declare whether they took a step forward or back or to the side, but yes, they did move from the position of stagnation. They decided to reject the theology of substitution in the chosen people. But I believe that what we need is an auto-reflection. We need to think not only about who Jews are to us, but we need to think about the original sin, about who God is, about personal evil, about our own evil. I believe that we all carry Auschwitz and Auschwitz oppressors. I do believe that we ought to think about our outlook on the world, and this is something we're all missing as Christians. Yes, we have another speaker. Andrzej Kopczyński. I have a question to the bishop concerning the Friday prayer. How do other people pray in Spain or Mexico, for example, and also a reflection. Christians are not only Catholics, although yes, we do have many Catholics, but we also have Protestants and the Orthodox and Lutherans. I would like to ask what their attitude is towards the Holocaust, because we have been speaking of Christians, but mainly, I must say, from the Catholic vantage point. Let us wait, we have another person who wants to speak, Dr. Dominika Kozłowska, the editor-in-chief of Znak. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that discussion, albeit I actually have come to think that given the company of persons who are deeply involved in the dialogue, and since we are discussing the advantages and disadvantages thereof, possibly what we are missing are the main addressees here in this lecture hall. Nevertheless, I do believe that it is hugely important to ask the following question. Whenever we discuss the elite or the Second Vatican Council or the episcopate or different initiatives, why did we not decide to take all that and graft it onto a lower level? Why is Polish anti-Semitism still so vivid, so terrifyingly vivid? I believe that we have been discussing different things concerning Catholic theology in Poland. Nevertheless, we should also focus on another matter, working on national identity and the bonds between that national identity and the actual figure of the Pole, the Catholic. I do believe that it is a hugely important question because it shows that it will be very difficult for us to change Polish liturgy. Also because anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism in the modern sense of the terms are intertwined. Bishop Ryś told us that in the 19th century the Church wanted to impact the world with methods which are definitely non-Christian and with methods that have nothing to do with the gospel. But our Polish experience tells us that over several centuries the Roman Catholic Church had acted as a substitute for a variety of institutions and variety of solutions, and those functions are not easily divided and are not easily named in the process of outlining identity. We should stop and think which missions of the Church are that of gospel and which are those of substitute. And probably you still remember what the Polish Catholic Church did several years ago. And I do believe that this is a knot not easily untieable. This is also a question to Bishop Ryś. Father, do you have any solutions as to what could be done at the level of working on the national and religious identity in order for the Polish Catholic identity to be deepened and expanded to include the root, the aforementioned root, in order to also open the Polish Catholicism beyond the very, very narrow understanding of the term nation? We had a very specific question about the Good Friday prayer in other languages. Others will require extensive discussion. Can we say a thing? Can we discuss that? Well, we can only base on what Janek said because I do not know the prayers in other languages. Yes, they're obviously there, but I do not know them. So I cannot provide you with a reliable answer because I do not know that. Populus prioris acquisitionis, that's the Latin version. In other words, the first chosen people of the covenant set up by God, which ultimately means that we do not have the Old and New Testament, but we have the First and the Second Testament. We have a chronology rather than the Old-New division. In France, we have the same texts in Latin. In Polish, we had the mistranslation. The people which used to be chosen 3 years ago, the Polish Episcopalian Council had confirmed the Latin original. That is the people of the first choosing. According to church rules, any change, any amendment to the liturgy has to be confirmed by the Vatican, not by the episcopate. So a letter has been sent to the Vatican. Yes, indeed, the Vatican shall be confirming all new translations. I do not know where the devil hid, whether it was behind the altar or not, with regard to what Mr. Dorosz said, but when listening to the panel, I believe that what we are facing is a huge religious war between Christians and Jews. Christians were accused of being passive. Nevertheless, we ought to be very open and explicit. There are certain differences between Christians and Jews, but that is different to the difference between Christians and the Nazis. Let us not identify Christians with the Nazis, with Germans under Hitler. And I do believe that we should well distinguish between the Nazi and the Christians. Yes, that is a hugely important matter. Possibly we should collect more comments or questions.
I have a couple of comments leading to a question. I referred in my speech this morning to the slaughter of Native Americans by people who thought they were obeying God's will. I heard later on a lot of worry about what was happening with Muslims in Europe, and then I heard worries from Father Pawlikowski about Christians being put to the sword. It seems to me that people seize on a god or the god in order to justify what they do. And bearing in mind what we've heard about human rights, it seems to me, is there not a good case that no person should be allowed to obey his god if it affronts the human rights of someone else? And my second question is this: hasn't the Catholic Church and the Church which is across Europe got what that old Yiddish word would call chutzpah? The Catholic Church's record during the Holocaust is quite shameful. The quietness of the Protestant churches in Europe towards the Holocaust is quite shameful. It really takes a bit of chutzpah for the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church to dictate to the state of Israel what they would be doing. What do you think the people of Israel would think to hearing moral lectures from people who did nothing as they went and were fried? So I think, as I say, is there a lot of chutzpah around?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Proszę ostatnia w tej chwili wypowiedź.
The final question from the floor. Well, I must say that I am very, very grateful for the comment on substitution, but I do believe that this is something that began when there was a priest on the Mayflower who also just referred to the Jews as the chosen people. But I must say that this is appropriation, that this is oppressive, because it is actually another religion with its own boundaries and its own rules. It ought to be an inspiration, but any form of patronizing is, I believe, a violation to the natural laws. Thank you very much. I do believe that a number of questions and comments have been offered requiring comments by panelists. The Nazis and Christianity, this is something that you reacted very vividly to.
I think we have to be extremely careful in saying, oh, well, there's just a sharp distinction between Christians and Nazis. It is true that the level of ideology, if you want to put it that way, Nazi ideology was fundamentally anti-religious, anti-Judaism, anti-Christianity. Nonetheless, I don't think it would have succeeded without what I would call the seedbed of classical anti-Semitism at the grassroots level. The majority of people who gave some support to the Nazi effort, even if it was by indifference, did not understand or even care much about Nazi ideology, but they did know the history of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. They had gone to Oberammergau, for example, in many cases, and so on. So I think there is a much, while I would agree the Nazi ideology was fundamentally anti-religious, nonetheless, that doesn't exempt it from the fact that it was tied very much at the grassroots level to classical forms of anti-Semitism.
And I remember that the most controversial point of the famous WMET Jewish Declaration on Christianity and Christians was the one about connection between Nazism and Christianity.
Exactly.
They started the point with statement Nazism was not a Christian phenomenon.
Right, and some leading Jewish figures, such as Rabbi James Rudin, who was a big leader from the Jewish side in the interreligious dialogue, refused to sign that document precisely because of that point.
Jak rozumiem to, ja rozumiem też pana wątpliwość oczywiście.
I understand. I also fully understand your doubt. Now, what we are after here is that we should understand how is it possible that in a European country, very much developed in terms of culture and civilization, where everybody had been baptized, everybody was baptized. That is a sociological fact. It is not a fact of faith, it is a sociological fact. So how is it possible that Christianity, which was so proliferated socially in Europe, could have given birth not to life but to death in the form of the Holocaust or Shoah? Why, in a sense, did Christianity prove to be weak or ineffective? Why on earth did it not work? We could definitely also offer a sociological response. Yes, Christianity is not a machine. It is not true that those who are witnesses to Christianity or to Jesus Christ, well, they are not a society, although they have been baptized en masse. This is also apparent in the fact that in Germany there were individual Christians who opposed the Nazis and who were themselves oppressed. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, just to mention one. The point is to emphasize a historical process proving that Christianity did not develop sufficiently well in order to be able to prevent something as horrific as Shoah. Could you please develop your thesis, Father, that the Nazis are not something that fell out of the clear blue sky, aliens? Well, I could. Most recently, I had been wandering around Auschwitz and Birkenau, Auschwitz slightly earlier, and I was accompanied by a very high-ranking Vatican official. It was his first time in Auschwitz, and he was deeply moved by what he saw. It was obvious. And I only allowed myself one comment, that thanks to his presence there, he might realize how important it is what he is doing. And he looked at me surprised, and he said, "Why?" He saw no connection between being a high-ranking Vatican official and this place. And I said, well, that was us. And he said, no, that was the Nazis. And that was his first automatic, non-reflective reaction. That was something that he carried within him, encoded. But I must say that, well, they were the Nazis who were also brought up in Christianity as Catholics, as Lutherans. This is also something that Professor Grosfeld mentioned. And that is a very important question in the historical discourse, the continuity. It is very easy to say, right, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. Anti-Judaism is something that we have been doing as Christians for the past 2,000 years, and anti-Semitism is what the Nazis introduced. But I still remember a paper that also Father Jan co-signed. I remember that this was a paper containing practices and different beliefs on the one hand, including publications of the Catholic Church over the ages, and the other side of the table involved a description of the law of the Third Reich, including everything, attire included. That was not thought of by the Nazis. Obviously, there was attire which was marked differently, and this was something that was thought up for the Jews because they decided to wear clothes which were not that dissimilar. So this is something that was thought up not by the Nazis, but by Christians as well. It is easy to say that that was only about form. But from what I know about history, there did come a moment in the history of Christian Europe when we were facing anti-Semitism at the ethnic, not religious level. Not at the level of a falsified Christian religion. What happened in Spain and Portugal in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, which was also then grafted onto the soil of colonies, actually was based on the principles of the pureness of race. Historically speaking, we could indeed explain how did that phenomenon come to pass. Nevertheless, it did happen. We did have the phenomenon in the very Christian part of Europe, because we do have the arch-Christian part of Europe in the West. But indeed, we did have racist Christianism which came to pass. It's very easy to pile one solution upon the other, but obviously we could quote Thomas Diaconus, but there is no such thing as an easy division. You have heard about very profound matters mentioned during the previous panels, and should anybody be willing to bind one comment to another from different panels, you are more than welcome. Well, let us come back. I would like to come back to the motive of the distinction between Nazis and Christians or Nazi Christians. Let me reiterate what I have said already. I am deeply convinced that Hitlerism has not been rooted in the essence of Christianity and what is best within it. As Jan Grosfeld said, Germans were baptized, but that means nothing. Baptism and sanctity is divided or are divided by an abyss. So we do have different brands of Christianity. Now, in terms of historical fact, we could refer to them as pragmatic. There were relations, distinct relations between Christianity and Nazism, and every history book will tell us so. Once we open a history book, we can find a photograph or photographs of German bishops raising their arms in the Heil Hitler sign. I believe that it should also be recalled that in the early years of Hitler's in office, he was approached by Catholic Church officials concerned about the future of Catholic Church or the Christian Church in Germany. And Chancellor Hitler said that despite anything to the contrary, he hugely supports the Church and specifically the Church's attitude towards the Jews, something of many years of history. Let me reiterate, we can claim that this has nothing to do with the essence of Christianity. Nevertheless, in terms of history and ideology, it did happen. Also, in what Bishop Ryś was very correct, also Professor Wolf Powęska wrote a book wherein we can find a table containing restrictions to Jewish life in the Dark Ages, whereas on the next page Or on the other side of the table, you can find the restrictions introduced by Hitler. So I do believe that we should separate the truth from anything and everything that might be counterfeit. I would also want to focus on two very important comments concerning Christian and national identity, and specifically how the two blend, hugely importantly for Poland. The bishop wanted to take the floor. If I may, I would like to add something to the German motive. Germans are only an experimental field for us, or a lab. When Benedict XVI went to Auschwitz, it was a very moving visit. When he was describing the Nazis, he said that something that many found shocking. He said that a few madmen seduced the entire German nation. And I thought to myself, how is it possible to think that way? Is it really true that the Pope himself had the issue, resulting in him referring to the German nation thus? Well, why do you refer to these people as madmen? And would it really be possible for a few madmen to seduce many millions? Well, okay, so how do we seduce Poles with our entangled identities? Well, seduction is always about something negative. Well, that is indeed true. So, yes, we have excellent intentions, but what we need to do is to take small steps. Dominika said that in Poland the church performed substitute functions. Yes, it did, because it had to. Well, all we have to say is that, well, we had to, so we did it. We no longer have to, so we will no longer do it, and it will only be for the better, I believe. I don't like the question whether the Polish church has to be Polish. I am trying to be a Pole and a Catholic, and I do hope that it will cause me no harm. It is the same thing that refers to the aforementioned memory. John Paul II, when speaking of Poland's past, he also had a tendency to declare that we should also remember that there are certain things hugely important to our remembrance and our history. It was also important to him. That is the Jagiellonian history and Jagiellonian tradition, of many layers, I must say, and multifaceted. Historically speaking, it did come to pass that as of the 17th century through the 19th century, we began shedding that Jagiellonian model, which does not necessarily mean that it has become out-fashioned. At the Józef Tischner Academy, I asked my students to read Włodkowic or Stanisław of Skarbimierz. And these were my political sciences or sociology students, not history students. And they actually discovered 15th century Polish texts. And I must say that they were hugely proud coming to my class, and I found it immensely beautiful. Indeed, that is the piece of history that remains within us. This is something that we have never read before. This is what they told me. I do apologize, but Polishness creates us. As Miłosz said, that my language forms me, which is why truth and justice are spelled with capital letters. I do not want to juxtapose Polishness with Catholicism. I don't see any reason for which we should do that. And please try and believe me that this is possible. Ladies and gentlemen, time has come to close our debate. I must say that in the wake of the words, of such words, of a Polish bishop, let me quote the final book of the John Paul The second, Poland is not about being closed. Poland is openness and pluralism. And I do believe that Jan Karski would definitely countersign what we have just said. Thank you.